good friend I got to know over a number of years is James. Very interesting guy, PhD in engineering, and started his own business, works with foreign companies as a liaison for military contracts. Just a lot of kind of intriguing things about him. Also a pretty sharp guy in terms of his thoughtfulness. So his thoughtfulness came especially in the reason he had his kids go to church. Because see, James didn't go to church. I had the opportunity to share the gospel with him multiple times. He's rather polite about it and said, Mitch, I really appreciate you explaining it to me. At one point, he even quipped after a conversation over coffee in which we talked through the gospel. And he said, so did it work? Am I converted? I said, if you're asking, nope. But James said he did want his kids in church because the Christian faith made the most sense in terms of a moral dynamic. Because everybody loves the golden rule. And he saw a lot of value in the golden rule. Love your neighbor as you would yourself. And he was saying, really, he hoped that Christians would not let America slip into Muslim hands. That's his view of it. Slip into Muslim hands, a growing demographic in the United States, that they would retain power because he believed the Christian concept of morality was the most faithful for society. Now, he was an admitted agnostic, functionally an atheist. God had no bearing on his life, even if he is out there somewhere. What makes it kind of interesting is that same phenomena or concept James had is also incredibly prevalent within the church. Here's the way it plays out within the church. I got to know it in the student ministry world. I was a pastor working with students for about 7 years. And in that time, working with students, you do all the stuff. You get used to how to garner a bigger attendance on Wednesday night in particular. And so one of the best things you can do is play games that are absolutely ridiculous. I've had students eat crickets. I've had students bob for pineapples and applesauce. I mean, just all this. Aren't you glad I'm not the student minister here? You thought you had them eat crickets. We didn't get sued. It was okay. So, had them do all the stuff. What you find is that you can draw students in. And they will come many times for really good reasons. What you also get aware of if you participate in enough student minister conferences is that the vast majority of high schoolers that participate in church leave the faith as they graduate. And when I say vast majority, granted, different stats for different churches. Lord willing, Woodlawn is better. It's 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10 claim they've left the faith when they graduated high school. Here's the other side of that, though. What makes that kind of interesting? They come back. Not all 8 out of 10. Not all 8 out of 10 come back. Many, though, do come back. Do you know when they come back? After they've had their first child. After their first child, they say, you know what? I think we need to get back in church. Because they saw the moral foundation they had, and they thought, we need to instill that in our kids. Here's what makes it, let's keep going with the stats though. That same group leaves again, leaves church again. As the kids leave the home, their church engagement dips, if not vanishes altogether. Because really, although they're around church, they're no different than James. It's a good moral foundation. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that's all it is. The sad reality of that is you're the frog in the pot. You feel like you've done enough, but really you don't realize you're headed towards boiling water. So Jesus is doing something really unique. He draws out what are the two greatest commandments. He draws them out. He just quotes the Old Testament. In fact, if you read Mark, the lawyer who's asking it says, yeah, I think you're right. So this concept is already floating around. It's not entirely new by any means. He's quoting the Old Testament. In fact, when he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, he's quoting the most commonly recited passage from Deuteronomy, from the Old Testament. Jesus just quotes back to them. They already know this, but here's what he does. In the passage, we connect this with the next one, because Jesus is talking to Pharisees. And as he's talking to the Pharisees, they ask their question, and he says, while they're still there, hey, while I've got you, while you're here, I got a question for you. What he's actually doing is he's correcting. You can't stop at moral goodness. You've got to wrestle with who is the Christ. Church, if we stop at moral goodness, you will only want a solid foundation for your kids. Grandkids. The grandkids you bring to church because mom and dad won't, that's all you'll want. We have to go to the next passage. Yes, this is a moral summation of the law. Bigger question, who's the Christ? So the way to put this idea together is to follow Jesus. So first we find Jesus can stand on one foot. Second, we find Jesus is God. But the real question is, the third idea, do you treasure Jesus enough to love your neighbor? So Jesus can stand on one foot. Jesus is God. Do you treasure Jesus enough to love your neighbor? Jesus can stand on one foot. So, if you follow the passage through, Jesus gets asked a series of questions. They're intended to trip him up. We've covered the others. He gets asked a political question. Should you pay taxes to Caesar? The idea was to get him in trouble with the authorities on a tax issue. Then he got asked a theological question about heaven. The idea was to make him look ridiculous. Well, he keeps coming through these and astonishing his listeners. Now he gets asked an ethical question. They want to make him look morally compromised. Here's the ethical dilemma. They come to him, which law is the greatest? There's 613 laws in the Old Testament, unique laws. That is not even including kind of the case study accounts that you have through the prophets and the history. So 613 laws. Which one's the most important? How should you rank them? Do you know we still struggle with this today? Ethical ranking of priority. The articles I've read have said Tesla has largely abandoned their autonomous driving because of the moral issues. There are a lot of issues with autonomous driving. The car is going to drive for you. The moral issue is the one they kept running into. They were worried about, unless they get legislation passed that would allow them to solidify the decisions they're making, they would be sued. Because here's the logic. If the Tesla driving itself is going down the road, 3 people step out in front of the car at 40 miles an hour. What does the car choose to do? Hit the 3 people? You don't have time to stop. Swerve and hit a tree, killing the driver? What's more valuable? The person in the car, the people in front of the car? So it got to this kind of moral conundrum real quickly. This also gets kind of teased out in other places. If you took a philosophy course at some point in college, perhaps. Is it wrong to lie? And you get all the students in the room saying, yes, I think it's generally wrong to lie. What if lying saves a life? And the most common example I've heard is Nazi Germany. You're protecting a Jewish family that's in the basement. They come looking for the Jews and they say, is anybody here beside yourself? Do you lie? We're the only people here. Or do you say it's wrong to lie? No, we've got a family down in the cellar, well, we would be quick to say, yeah, you lie. You lie. At that point, yes, you lie, because you just ranked 10 commandments. This is the argument. You said killing is worse than lying. So if I have to lie to prevent killing, I will. So they come to Jesus. Jesus, how do you rank the law? What they're looking for is a real quippy, short answer. How do you rank the law? How can you kind of sum up what's most important? That time and place, Jesus' day, they had a way of saying this, that you should be a good lawyer. They were not really a lawyer. If you could think constitutional law, a law expert, that's more what we're dealing with here than the guy chasing the camel ambulance. So, he's an expert on the law. He comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, summarize the law. What's the most important? The way they said that most often was, can you summarize the law while still standing on one foot? Well, the thought was, once you get into kind of all the nuanced differences of 613 laws, you're going to lose your balance well beforehand. Jesus does it. He could have done it standing on one foot. He says, yes, the greatest command is love the Lord your God with everything in you. Love the Lord your God with your whole life. Your whole life should be devoted to loving God. Of course, he says it with more specificity. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first commandment, and a second, a lesser commandment, one that derives its right perspective from the first, is love your neighbor as yourself. That love the Lord your God is, as I said, a quote from Deuteronomy 6:5. Because every time you show up in synagogue, you start your service the same way. A quotation of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and verse 5. And verse 4 says, "Hear, O Israel." The word "hear" is the word Shema in Hebrew. So this portion of Scripture got the nickname, the Shema. So Jesus is just quoting back to them the Shema, the most familiar portion of the law. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might in Deuteronomy 6:5. Here it's mind, has the same connotation. So what does it mean to love God with everything in you? 3 just quick ideas, observations. You probably came up with these on your own at some other point in time if you've heard this verse before. First, it's primary. This is going to come back around, but it's primary. We can only rightly love neighbor when we first love God. It's primary. Secondly, it's positive. Here's what's kind of interesting about it. It's a positive rule. What I mean is, a lot of rules, especially in Christendom, have only been presented in the negative. I grew up with a grandmother who had a lot of rules. We knew that you did not eat at a restaurant that served alcohol. So we had Shoney's and Cracker Barrel, and God rest her soul, she wouldn't eat at Cracker Barrel anymore. So, some of it, I just ruined it for you. They now serve beer and wine. We had a lot of other rules. You certainly weren't going to use any foul language. I don't know what happened if you used foul language. I had one cousin that did find out what happens when you use foul language, but that took place outside somewhere, and I didn't even venture. I wasn't even going to look out the window. Right? So I thought, whew, he's not coming back. So, a lot of rules. This one is not stated in the negative, right? It's not stated as don't do this. Although many commands in the Old Testament are. This is stated in the positive, which makes it more comprehensive. Let me show it to you from the love thy neighbor portion. And the 10 Commandments you get, you shall not commit adultery. Or thou shalt not, if you're King James. Thou shalt not commit adultery. If you say it in the positive, though, of love thy neighbor, Lord willing, your spouse is your closest neighbor, he's not just saying don't have any inappropriate relationships. Be lovingly committed to your spouse. But it's stated in the positive. The Bible doesn't say only you shall not steal. Certainly a 10 commandment. The New Testament demonstrates that if it's in the positive, you don't also not steal. I love Ephesians says, you actually go get a job so you can earn money so you can give generously. It's in the positive. So when it comes to God, it's the same thing. We hear, do not use the Lord's name in vain, 10 commandments again. It's the negative. Jesus is emphasizing the positive. Let every breath honor God. Love Him. So it's in the positive. It's primary, it's in the positive. Thirdly, it's comprehensive. It's comprehensive. So we get the tripartite description of how you shall love. You shall love with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your will, all your determination. The New Testament takes it in a different slant. It says you should treasure Christ above all else. Let me show you why that's comprehensive. I read an article. The article was written by somebody who was trying to counsel a man with a video game addiction. The man claimed, I know for some of you, I said video game addiction, you immediately rolled your eyes. Bear with me for a second. Some of you, other end of the spectrum, were like, amen, brother. Been struggling for years. Can't wait to get out of here. So, video game addiction. Here's what the counselor was writing in the article. The young man claims to be a Christian, says he realizes that he's so consumed by this one particular game, I don't recall what it was, but so consumed by this one particular game, he was neglecting other things in life. And he said, I don't know how to pull away from it. I'm just addicted. Well, the counselor is making a clever assessment of it. Addiction implies involuntary behavior. Is this young man struggling involuntarily with video games? So she said, this is not, the author, she said, this is not necessarily the case across the board, but with this particular young man, she made a really quick assessment. She said, would you give that game up if I offered you $100,000? Well, his affirmative answer, yeah, I could probably get it up for $100K. Really brought it all the way down. Obviously, then it is not entirely involuntary. Furthermore, though, it's really showing what he treasures. He treasures money more than the game, but he treasures both more than Christ. Or let's maybe make it, just bear with me for a second, slightly more pointed. Do you treasure Christ above all else than the sin you struggle with? What would it require? What's your price tag to drop it? Do you drop pornography for $1 million? What's your price tag? If there is a price tag to drop sin, then we love money more than the sin, but we love both more than Christ. So what Jesus is doing is he's saying, if that's the case, your view of God is too small. Who God is to you is too small. He realized that that was the case for his original hearers. So this is where we get to our follow-up question. When Jesus says, I've got a question for you. Hold on, before you go anywhere, I got a question. Our second idea, Jesus claiming to be God. So he says, as Matthew cleverly connects it, now while the Pharisees were gathered together, while they're still there, Jesus asked them a question. Turnabout's fair play. What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? He's asking really a low-level question to this group. It was a well-studied concept. David's son. They answer it, the son of David. Jesus, on the one hand, would say, you're correct. That's right. He's the son of David. The reason it was so well known that he's the son of David is because of a promise. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, David was promised, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me in his name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. David, at that time, consumed their thoughts. When you have time, if you Google the word David and Google the word Jesus, biblical occurrences, you find out David is mentioned more often than the Bible than Jesus. David consumed the imagination. We want another David. And we have this promise in 2 Samuel, we'll get another David. Because David offered a few things. David offered peace. He was the mightiest warrior king they had known. He also offered security. Because what he began to do, and he was the only king to do it, is he began to expand Israel's territory into regions where they had known enemies. So he's a warrior is going to say, you're going to get peace with me. But you're also going to get security. That security led to economic prosperity because his son Solomon flourished beyond anybody's wildest dreams. But it didn't come because of Solomon's prowess. It becomes because of David's provision. And then ultimately, it's an opportunity for health because over and over again in the New Testament, they call out to Jesus, Son of David, heal me. 2 blind men are healed. Son of David, heal me. And another one who has a Syrophoenician woman who has a demon in her child is cast out. Son of David, heal me. 2 more blind men are healed. So the concept is this. We're waiting for the next king. Some of you in the room think we finally got the president we want back in office. He's going to start providing. One guy had a video he put out, and he walked outside on Wednesday after the election, and he says, things already smell cheaper. And I thought, I don't know if that's good. You could kind of take that a couple different ways. But they thought that's what we need. We need a leader in office who's going to provide peace and security, economic prosperity, and even health. That would be a Messiah. And Jesus says, your view of who the Messiah is inadequate, insufficient, too small. Here's how he demonstrates that. He quotes from Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? If you're waiting for one of David's descendants to take the throne, why does David call him Lord while he's still alive? So we're not looking for one of David's descendants. We're looking for one greater than David. Well, they have no response, no answer. The reason they have no response and no answer is a pretty well-known concept. I'll tell you where we saw it, kind of in a colorful way. Prince Charles, you remember his coronation last year, 2023? At his coronation, a couple things really stood out. I don't know if you watched it. A couple things really stood out. One of which was he sat in a really old, rickety wooden throne. I don't know if you caught that. It was kind of in the middle of everything. He sits on this old, rickety wooden throne. And so it got a lot of press, so to speak. The rickety throne is really one that was built in the year 1296. It was built by King Edward. It's called King Edward's chair, or the coronation chair. Since then, everybody who's gone through coronation in England or Great Britain's royal court, except for two, have sat on that throne at their coronation. This old rickety wooden chair. What makes it especially peculiar and what really stood out, and as I heard it commented on later, it was one of the things you notice. It's way too big. It looks like when you take a kid and you sit them up in a seat for a second. It looks like Charles was a kid and he got sat in the seat. The throne's too big for him. I mean, if you're going to really rest your arms on it, you'd be about 4 feet wide, and then the back is entirely too tall. So he's 4 feet wide, 10 feet tall. King Edward's, had the throne constructed to exaggerated dimensions on purpose. The idea is this. It is to convey the magnitude of responsibility of ruling the empire. As one author, Sean O'Donnell, quotes, "No one person can fill the greatness of Great Britain's royal rule. It's bigger than one man." The problem for the Pharisees is what they envisioned a leader who could produce the great life would be, was a throne that fit a person. Jesus shows up and he says it is entirely too big to just fit a person. That's why David said to his Lord, who would be the Messiah. If your view of Christ is so small, he can fit in a typical throne, you've misunderstood. Psalm 110 draws that out. Jesus doesn't just reference this psalm because it's kind of a biblical conundrum. It is the psalm that draws out the magnitude of the Messiah, the one who is to come. So if all you've been waiting for is essentially a really good president, listen to the actual description. Psalm 110, verse 1. He says, he will place your enemies under your feet. Let me draw out that image real quickly. I thought for a long time it was a guy sitting in a stool. Place your enemies under your feet would be like propping them up in a recliner. Joshua gives us the real image. Joshua captures the land of these kings. He pulls the 4 kings out before the people because he wants the people to know your enemies can no longer hurt you. So here's what he does. He has all the kings laid face down on the ground, and he has each one of his military leaders come up to these kings and put their foot on the neck of the king. And they stand there with their foot on the neck of each king. As Joshua says, you see this? These men will never touch you again. Jesus' enemies are sin, Satan, and death, and he's put his foot on their neck. These things will never touch you again. Your Messiah in verse 2 of Psalm 110 says he has a mighty scepter. It's total rule. It's total rule forever. Let me make an appeal to you about total rule. All the text messages you got from political PACs, you have to go through that again in just 3 years from now. Wouldn't it be nice to have a perfect ruler who is going to rule for eternity and I never have to think about it again? Verse 4 says that he is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the only priest king in the Bible until you come to Christ. The reason you want a priest As a priest is a phenomenon that in Baptist churches we only see in movies when somebody walks into a little booth and talks to a Catholic representative about all their sins that they've done wrong. A priest really intercedes. He's a go-between between you and God. You do want a priest. You just don't want me to be priest. I don't like the collar. There's a lot of issues. You don't want me to be priest because I'm an insufficient priest. You want Christ as priest, so that when you say, I'm sorry, you have the one who will actually take it before the feet of God. And when he says, I grant forgiveness, the one who will actually apply it to your life. And the writer of Hebrews says he is going to function in the priest role on your behalf for the rest of eternity. Let me say it differently. If 1,000 years from now, Jesus stopped being priest, you would go to hell at that point. But he's promising to be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. He will stand on your behalf before God and then administer grace into your life for forever. 1,000 years from now, you're still dependent upon Jesus to be your priest. Verse 6 says that he renders total justice. Some of you, I don't know this applies across the board just because we live in a society where we don't face rampant, grotesque crime all the time. Some of you have known evil acts in your life. And the perpetrator, still to this day, has gotten off scot-free. Jesus comes to destroy evil. Psalm 10, verse 6, he will render justice. It will be done. Period. Jesus is citing this psalm, saying if all you want at the end of your days is to have been upper middle class, live to be 100, see your grandkids successful, and you think that's what the Messiah should provide, you've got a tiny little throne that really is no bigger than your own pitiful imagination. He says, what you need to realize is the responsibilities far outweigh anything we could dream up, and Psalm 110 begins to lay the foundation for it. Here's why we need this, though. It is only when we have a Christ bigger than our imaginations that he captivates our hearts enough to set the priority straight. Here's what I mean. Jesus said, love the Lord your God, that's first. Love your neighbor as yourself. If we keep them in that order, what that would entail is the way you love your neighbor is dictated by the Christ you serve. Not the way that they want to be loved, the way that God defines love. I would say when we come to that moral code, this is one of the most common missteps in American society. We think that somebody should be loved for just for who they are. And it sounds good. I mean, that's why every husband puts on a few pounds when he gets married, right? And then, you should love me for who I am. And he starts to swell up like a sausage. So, that idea, you should just love me for who I am. You should not have any expectations on me. That would be unloving. That's the most prevalent view of love in our society. It's full acceptance of anything you desire in your life. The Bible points out, and helpfully so, that's actually self-love. That's me loving myself. I know you're headed for something that's destructive, but I don't want to speak up and say anything because then you won't appreciate me any longer. So I'm going to stay silent in regards to you headed for destruction because I want to stay in your good graces. Let me say it differently. It's the believing parents that don't want to tell their adult children, I think what you're doing is sin. because they might not come over for Thanksgiving 3 weeks from now. You really love yourself more than your kids. It's tough. I get that it's tough. But if you put it in that order, and Jesus gets to define love because He's Christ, as we described. He's the one who's going to reign supreme. And because I'm devoted to Him, I know how to love somebody else. Church, in just a moment, we're going to have a membership meeting if you're a member. That idea, that concept, drives what we're going to do in our membership meeting. And I just need you to hang on to that for a second. It's going to drive what we're doing. We are entirely devoted to Christ, and we love Christ. Therefore, we love our neighbor. And if you're out of step with Him, then that means catastrophic things. And so we're going to come back to you, longing for you to go back to Him. Let me make it real practical one more way. If you envision a couple, something I've used, talked through in counseling many times. Oftentimes, couples will get to the spot where they know their spouse well enough. They see how they could grow in Christ. They really do. They know their spouse, like God as a spy, come into your life through marriage just to get to know you well enough so they could point out the faults. Right? So God's spy got to know you well enough. So I tell God's spy, I think this is an issue worth confronting. You know that spouse will tell me? Man, I'm not about to bring this up. It would take us a month to get over that fight. At minimum, they'll say, man, I don't know. I don't want to ruin a whole weekend. Ephesians 5 tells husbands, be more concerned for your wife's sanctification. Be more concerned for your wife's relationship with Christ than you are your weekend, than you are what might transpire for you over the weekend. It's worth risking the month because I love Christ first, and instead of loving me, I actually love you, and I want you to be in relationship with Him. Because He is this incredible, supreme King who sits on a throne I can't even imagine. Here's how that plays out right now in this moment. If you do not have a relationship with Christ, and the reason you've been coming to church is because you want your kids to have a moral foundation, then you are a frog in water, and the temperature's going up, and one day it will boil. And you need to hear a warning that apart from Christ, an actual relationship with Him, there are real dire consequences. Because I've come to know Him and I love you. Please put your faith and trust in Him. Would you stand as we sing this final song together?